Thank you, Hannah. Thank you, Carmela. And thank you, the Foreign Students Unit that invited me to give this lecture. So I'm going to talk about the fight against genocide and the fight of terrorism. And that means that we will discuss the core crimes and the laws of war in international law, because both of them have repercussions for what is happening now, and sadly what happened on October 7th. And so we're going to discuss two different fields in international law that are also related to each other. The first would be international criminal law, when we would discuss core crimes and the crime of genocide, and then we would discuss the laws of war, and that would refer to what is happening now in Gaza and the Israeli response to the atrocities committed on October 7th, the day of Simchat Torah. So let's begin with the first topic. So there are three core crimes in international law, and I will present them in the order of their appearance or their emergence in international law. The first ones are war crimes. These are grave breaches of the laws of war that began to develop from the 19th century. And so the war crimes were already developed along with the laws of war. As I said, grave breaches of those laws. Examples would be the torture of combatants, of prisoners of war, the intentional killing of civilians, the destruction of civilian property or damage to civilian, which is not proportional to the military advantage that is supposed to be gained, etc. So the war crimes can be committed during war, and they can be committed either against civilian combatants or against civilians. Crimes against humanity were a category that developed after the Second World War. They were response to the shock that the international community experienced after World War II, and with the recognition that crimes can be committed during peace times, not only during war, and moreover that the international community had to govern the way that a government addresses its own civilians, because Nazi Germany was actually claiming that whatever it did inside Germany was according to the Nazi law, so according to its internal law. So there was kind of a gap in international law that had to be filled with the idea that international law should govern also the relationship between a government and its citizens. And therefore, crimes against humanity are actually committed against civilians and not against soldiers or combatants. And they include a wide range of activities that affect, that hurt the physical integrity of the human body and the dignity of human beings. And so they include a wide range of activities that include killing and, of course, maiming and sexual violence. Also, they include incitement and persecution, and looting and other activities that could be thought as inflicting a great damage to people. And then genocide. So crimes against humanity were the category that was used to address the atrocities that the Nazis committed during the Jewish Holocaust and World War II. And quite surprisingly, it wasn't called genocide. But after the Nuremberg trials, which were the trials that in which the Nazi leaders, military and civil leaders, were prosecuted by the international community. So after these trials were concluded, the international community decided that a specific crime should be accepted as addressing the specific atrocities that the Nazis committed, the extermination of the Jewish people, also extermination of the Romani people. And this was called genocide. Genocide means side is the Latin for killing, and geno as a species, as a people, so the killing of a people. And what does genocide then mean? This was the legal definition of genocide was adopted by an international convention that was accepted by the United Nations General Assembly in 1948. And genocide then means any of the following acts that you could see here: killing members of the group. So you can see that the group is very important here, and I will refer to it in a couple of seconds. The causing of serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, the deliberate infliction of conditions of life that are calculated to bring about the physical destruction of the group, the imposition of measures that are intended to prevent births within the group, and the forcible transferring of children from one group to another group. But all of these activities could also be counted as crimes against humanity. So what turns them into genocide, into the destruction of the group, is what we call a mental element, the intent, the special intent to destroy a group in whole or in part, a group which is either one of those that are mentioned here: national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. So when these acts, or one of these acts, are committed with the intent to destroy the group in whole or in part, you don't have to bring about, or even to intend to bring about, the destruction of the whole group, then you are committing genocide, or not, God forbid, a person is committing genocide. So as we can see, the problem, the difficulty with this crime is with its proof. How do we prove genocide? Now, before I talk about that, I want to shatter some myths about genocide. Genocide is not defined by the number of victims. We hear in the media, we hear in the popular discourse that people are shocked when many people are killed, and even we even hear now those claims saying Israel is committing genocide in Gaza, and this is completely not true. We will relate later on to what Israel is doing in Gaza, but however great the damage to civilians in Gaza may be, and even if a large number of civilians in Gaza are unfortunately killed, this is not genocide, because genocide is defined by the special intent to destroy the group, and we can very positively say that Israel does not intend to destroy the Palestinian people. Whereas what we saw on October 7, and with what we know about the incitement, the overall incitement that is happening all the time in Gaza by Hamas everywhere, from the mosques to the media, to the theaters, to the schools, there were reports and research that prove, and even media reports that have shown how children are incited in summer camps to hate the Jews, to hate the Israelis, and to intend to destroy the state of Israel. Of course, in Hamas covenant, it is formally stated that the purpose of Hamas is to destroy Israel and the Israelis. So what happened in October 7 is for sure genocide. But the crime of genocide is very difficult to prove because proving this specific intent is not so easy. Usually, we look for supporting evidence to prove the special intent, as I said, incitement or cultural genocide, which would mean the destroying of cultural artifacts of the group, literature, houses of prayer, anything that is related to the cultural language of the group. Then when you find evidence for all of these, this actually serves as proof for the special intent of genocide. Now, these are some examples, or maybe even it's not just examples, but a review of the genocide that have taken place during the 20th century and onwards to our times. We could begin even before the Jewish Holocaust, although, as I said, the International Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide was actually adopted after the Jewish Holocaust and as kind of a response to the Jewish Holocaust. But there was also an Armenian genocide in World War I committed by the Ottoman Empire against the Armenians in the empire. Also, the Romani people were victims of genocide in World War II. There was genocide committed by Indonesia in 1975 against the East Timorese. The Maya people were the victims of genocide in Guatemala in 1981 to 1983. Kurds were victims of genocide by Saddam Hussein regime in Iraq in 1988. They were gassed, sarin gas, with the gas of sarin. And Srebrenica massacre, maybe you've heard of it, in former Yugoslavia during the civil war that took place in the former Yugoslavia. So the Serbs that massacred the Muslim Bosniaks, the Muslim Bosniak, and the Tutsi that were victims of genocide by the Hutu in Rwanda in 1994. In Darfur, the African tribes were victims of genocide that was committed by the Janjaweed militia. Maybe you've heard of it. In Sudan in 2003, the Yazidi genocide that was committed by ISIS in Iraq, but during the war in Syria. So the Yazidis were actually brought to, those that were not killed were enslaved and abused and sexually abused and terrible and horrible things that you can imagine. And they were actually interned in camps in northern Syria in 2014. The Rohingya, that are a Muslim minority in Myanmar, that is the new name of the country that was called once Burma, in 2017. They were victims of genocide of the regime the regime of Myanmar, the army that was actually that was ordered to commit these crimes by the government, and the what we call the president, she's called in a different name, Aung San Suu Kyi, who actually was a Nobel Prize winner, if you could imagine that, for peace. And the Uyghurs are a minority, a Turkic Muslim minority in northwest China. This genocide is still ongoing, and the Uyghurs genocide is different from the others because this is not taking place within a situation of war or armed conflict, but the Chinese are actually detaining arresting the Uyghur population in forced labor camps, where they are prohibited from using their own language and practicing their religion, and they are forcibly acculturated into the dominant culture of China, which is the Han Chinese culture. So maybe you've heard also about the Uyghur genocide. And now we also have evidence that genocide is taking place in the Ukrainian war, that Russia actually denies the existence of a Ukrainian identity and intends to actually to eliminate the Ukrainian people, to eliminate their identity. So this is a review of genocides in the 20th and 21st century. And so what are the legal implications of the fight against genocide? Because we came to the recognition that what happened in October 7 was in fact genocide. So what can we do with this determination, with this conclusion that we have come to? So first, we can actually invoke the principle of responsibility to protect, called also R2P, which means that the international community has actually an obligation to stand by Israel to stand by Israel not only in speaking and in speeches, but actually to take action and maybe to fight with its military, to launch a war against Hamas, as well as Israel does it. There is actually, it is legitimate for the international community to intervene militarily, with its military forces in this situation. And also there is the possibility to prosecute the criminals, the Hamas criminals that were not killed or that would manage to survive or to flee. And so they could be prosecuted either in the International Criminal Court that was established in 1998 for this exact purpose, to prosecute people that commit war crimes, crimes against humanity, or genocide. The problem for Israel in the International Criminal Court is that it is quite biased against Israel, so I'm not sure that this would be the preferred trajectory for Israel to follow. But also, there can be these people can be prosecuted in national courts around the world that invoke the principle of universal jurisdiction. What does universal jurisdiction mean? Usually, courts have jurisdiction over crimes that either happen in their own territory, or in their own state's territory, or they were committed by citizens of the state, or the victims were citizens of the state whose national courts apply jurisdiction. But there is also the idea that there are crimes that are in the interest of the whole international community, that it is the interest of the international community to suppress. And for these crimes, which are the core crimes that I have referred to, we can apply universal jurisdiction, which means that any state, any national court where its state has laws that prohibit the commission of these crimes and therefore allow for the application of jurisdiction, can apply jurisdiction over these people. And actually, the precedential case for this universal jurisdiction was the Eichmann trial in Israel. Israel actually it kidnapped Eichmann, but it brought Eichmann to Israel and put him to trial, although there was no connection between Eichmann and Israel. Of course, Eichmann was, of course, not an Israeli citizen, God forbid, and even the victims were not Israelis, because Israel did not exist when the Holocaust occurred. And also, of course, the crimes were not committed in Israel. And yet, according to the principle of universal jurisdiction, Israel could apply its jurisdiction over Eichmann, and indeed put Eichmann to trial and inflicted upon him the capital punishment. And before I move on to the second topic of this presentation, which is the laws of war, I just want to say that the question of what kind of punishment would be inflicted upon those people that could be prosecuted for the commission of the crime of genocide, well, I think that it generally won't be capital punishment, not in the international court at least, because now the International Criminal Court does not allow for capital punishment. There is quite, it is a controversial punishment, but perhaps there are states where the capital punishment still exists, and if they invoke the principle of universal jurisdiction, they could definitely inflict capital punishment upon defendants, or upon those who would be convicted. So this is the first part of the presentation. And now I move on to the second part, where I would like to review the laws of war, because the laws of war actually govern what happened now in Gaza, and they govern the Israeli response to the horrible events of October 7. And of course, I would talk about the laws of war and how is the fight against terrorism affects the application of the laws of war. So the main part of the laws of war developed from the 19th century to the 1970s, and they continue to develop today, but the core part was developed in this time that I mentioned. And then we would see how the fight against terrorism kind of required a paradigmatic change, because it is problematic to apply the traditional laws of war, as we would later on see. And the central instruments or documents where the laws of war are written are the Hague Conventions of 1907, the Geneva Conventions of 1949, and the protocols additional to the Geneva Conventions of 1977. So the historical source for the development of the laws of war was the Solferino battle. That was a battle between Italy and France that were allies in this battle against the Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria. And to this battle that was held in northern Italy, in the Lombardia section of Italy, arrived a very interesting person called Henri Dudin. He was a Swiss person, a businessman and an entrepreneur that had some ideas to discuss with Napoleon III, not the famous Napoleon, but his nephew. And he came over there to the battle, and he was shocked by the scene of 10,000 of soldiers that lie down on the ground because they were wounded, and nobody took care of them, not even their own not even the party to the conflict to which they belonged. And this brought up to him the idea that something should be done in order to take care of the victims of war. And this was the infrastructure for the development of the laws of war and the establishment of the International Committee of the Red Cross, that became the organization that actually supervises the application of the laws of war. So the laws of war that were developed, and the main instrument was the Geneva Conventions, were rules that govern the conduct of the parties in war, that provide, on the one hand, for means to secure the military necessity, and on the other hand, to protect the victims of armed conflict. And the victims of armed conflict are the people that are no longer involved in the war. That is to say, prisoners of war, wounded soldiers, or what we call combatants, and also civilians. So the victims are not only civilians, but also those soldiers that are no longer part of the war, as you can see here. So this means that the general principles that govern the laws of war are military necessity on the one hand and humanity on the other hand, and they have to intersect. They are not contradictory. They actually complete each other, you can say. So you have to understand that the laws of war do not prohibit war. They only try to minimize the suffering for those not involved in war, as I just said before. And so the principles of the laws of war are the following. Military necessity allows for the army to do what is required to win the war. So this also means that every combatant has a right to fight, but he or she is also a legitimate target, so they can be killed. But it's lawful for them to kill, as long as they obey the laws of war. And the other important principle is the principle of distinction, which means that while combatants and military targets are legitimate targets, civilians and civilian targets are not legitimate targets. And then you would tell me, so what do you mean? Civilians are always killed, and we see how many civilians are now killed by the Israeli army. Does that mean that the Israeli army breaches the laws of war? So not at all, because there is a reservation here that I'm going to delve into later on. And this would be the principle of proportionality. I would explain maybe in 10 minutes or less. So, and again, all of the people who are no longer involved in war must be protected. But what I'm saying here, what I was describing here, was the traditional concept. The traditional concept was that the parties to the conflict are states, not terrorist organizations that generally abide by the laws of war, but terrorism, which breaches the basic principle of the laws of war, and in particular the principle of distinction. How does it do that? The terrorists target civilians intentionally. The terrorists do not wear uniform. They do not distinguish themselves from the civilian population. And they use, or actually abuse, the civilian population as human shields. So all of this actually required a paradigmatic change, but this only followed the 9/11 attack on the Twin Towers in New York City, because until that time, it was basically Israel that has been confronting terrorism, and then the international community was not very much preoccupied with Israel's problem. But when it came to the United States, the major power, then things were beginning to change. But here again, we have to shatter some myths. Because don't think that the fight against terrorism, even after 9/11, changed the laws of war. No, it only adapted the existing law to the current situation. And why is that? Because the laws of armed conflict change slowly, because they are contingent on states' interests. And there are many states who have no interest in changing the laws of war. These would be the states that are not engaged in war, and even the states that are engaged in war, but if they are major powers, such as the US or Russia, sorry for that, such as the US or Russia, then perhaps they have no interest in changing the laws of war, because they have no interest in changing the laws of war because they think that they could do whatever they want And so the law could stay beautifully written as it is, and they don't mind. So this is why the laws cannot change so easily. But, and also, you must understand that terrorist organizations and other organizations are not bound by the laws of war or by international law in any event, because it is only states that are parties to these international conventions, and only upon states you can enforce the submission to the laws of war. So you can never say we need to make Hamas obey the laws of war. This is not the case. And another maybe disappointing myth that I would shatter here: you cannot demand reciprocity. You cannot say if one party to the conflict does this, then it allows the other party to act accordingly. And if one party does not obey, then the other would also not. No, this is not how international law functions. And then you would probably say, so what can we do? Our hands are completely tied. Can we even win the war while abiding by the laws of war? And here I would surprise you and I would say, yes, we can. And I would explain how Israel can win while still obeying the law. Also, maybe we should avoid questions or remarks such as, you know, the world is always against Israel. And as I said before, does Russia even obey the laws of war? Does the US even do that? Or do we gain anything by following the laws of war? Actually, we do gain, but I'm not sure this is the discussion I want to engage in right now. I want to show you how the law actually provides for a possibility for Israel to win while still obeying the law. So let's do that. Again, let's begin with, and I would exemplify this with the principle of proportionality. I want to remind you that when I said that civilians cannot be targeted, I said, well, there is a reservation, and the reservation is the principle of proportionality. So I'm going to refer to proportionality now. And let's begin with what proportionality is not. Proportionality is not what the media tells us. It is not about equating or creating a balance between the casualties of the parties. You don't say, because of the fact that one party suffers many more casualties than the other party, then it means that the state's behavior is not proportional. This is not true at all. And also, it is not the mere excessive damage to civilians that means that the military operation is not proportional. So what is proportionality? Let's try to see. So the definition of proportionality is this is a quote from the additional protocols to the Geneva Convention, and it says the following: the following types of attacks are to be considered as indiscriminate, which would also mean they are not proportional, when an attack is expected to cause incidental loss of civilian lives. You see, it is incidental, so it means that the civilians were not targeted intentionally. What was targeted intentionally was a military target, and the civilians were in the vicinity of these targets, and this is why they were targeted, or they suffered damage. So this incidental loss of civilian life or injury to civilians or damage to civilians' objects would be excessive, but in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated. So what do we see here? We see here two values. We see a military advantage, which is concrete and direct on the one hand, and on the other hand, damage to civilians and civilian targets. And we need to create a balance between them. And you can see that in this image of the scale. The scale should be actually balanced. I think it's not really balanced in this image, but it should be, which means that you put on the one side of the scale the military advantage, and on the other hand, you put the damage to civilians. And when you create a balance, it means that the act was proportional. But now you're going to ask me, what does that really mean? You're just talking so in an abstract way. How do we make this concrete? What do you mean when you say military advantage on one side of the scale and damage to civilians? Can we put their values, mathematical values? Well, not really. You see that the equation is not mathematical, because we don't really know what is the worth of the military advantage and the worth of civilian lives. And also there is the problem of the terrorist organization that abuses the principle by using human shields, but leave that alone right now. So what can we say? How do we make this proportionality test concrete? So we have auxiliary tests to assess proportionality. We have to ask ourselves, or the army actually has to ask itself, are there any alternatives? Was there another practical military act that would have brought about the same military advantage, but with a minimized damage to civilians? And if there were, and it was not applied, then the operation was not proportional, or the specific part of the operation was not proportional. So you have to ask, were there alternatives? Also, you can estimate the worth of the values of the military advantage and the damage to civilians by asking, what do we know about the significance of the military advantage and the chances to achieve it? So if you have, as much as the military advantage is more significant, and also you know that the chances to achieve it are more are higher, then you can suffer on the other side greater damage to civilians. And to give you a very extreme but important example, I would say, had the Allies in World War II known that they could eliminate, kill Hitler, then damage to perhaps hundreds of thousands of civilians would have been justified, because the military advantage is so significant, is so important, then it could justify a greater damage to civilians. And the final auxiliary test would be a procedural test, which would mean me as the, or I as the legal expert, I have no idea what is the military advantage and how to assess the damage to civilians. But what I can do is find out whether the military has considered all of the relevant considerations. I can check as a legal expert, or the court can check and verify how the decision was made, if all the considerations were taken into consideration, were considered, and if maybe what we call the devil's advocate was heard, and if there were no what we call foreign considerations taken into account, then we can say that whatever the army decided is legal and actually is fulfilling the proportionality test. And also, almost we're reaching the end of the presentation. I want to address the question of the human shields. The fact that even if we try to apply all of these tests that I just mentioned, then the terrorist organization actually laughs at our face and say, whatever calculation you're making, I'm going to bring in more and more civilians. And so you would never reach any equation in this kind of this balance that you're trying to create. So how do we get out of this sort of conundrum? We have to do the following, as the army actually does, the IDF actually does, to give warnings and call for the evacuation of civilians. As you can see, the army does that every day and creates safe zones for them to flee while there is military activity taking place in the north of Gaza. They are called to flee to the south. And also, if still they are not obeying the army's calls, then we can use the principle of reduction. What does that mean? It means that when you do this calculation, you're saying, if Hamas brought too many people, too many civilians nearby the military targets, we are going to reduce them, not to take them into consideration when we do the equation. So this principle was very much criticized because it kind of meant that the principle of proportionality lost its meaning. And so it was kind of limited with these three rules, suggesting that you must continue with giving warnings, and also you must show that you have no option, because the terrorist organization is using this tactic of human shields relentlessly. And so there was no other alternative or another time to conduct the operation. And this would actually give the army the justification to apply this principle of reduction. And this is it. So now I'm ready for your questions, and thank you for your attention. And I hope you learned something, and please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for an absolutely fascinating lecture. And there were many things here that I didn't know, and I'm very glad that I got the chance to hear it. I have a question. I've heard a story once. I don't know if that's true. You'd probably be able to tell me, but the story was that the khaki uniforms were invented by the British Army, and the British Army were scolded or looked down by everyone else in warfare, saying that they have no honor. That before that, people used to wear bright uniforms that you could distinguish between, like between armaments, between who's yours and who's not yours. And the British had no honor. They invented those terrible khaki uniforms so they could hide in the woods or do whatever, kind of engage in a different type of warfare. And basically they breached the existing laws of war to win. And the question is, could that happen again? Could something, could a new way of waging war be accepted in today's world?
I'm not sure I understood the last part. Just you
would
clarify.
Is there a way, or if someone came up with a crazy idea on how we do things from now,
I like that. They would justify what Hamas is doing? Are you saying?
No. I'm not trying to say. I'm not trying to to justify Hamas.
No, not you. But are you saying that?
No. I'm saying that it seems like we're in a stalemate. That there's nothing. You've mentioned that equation, and you mentioned like there's no way to get out of it. Anything the law-abiding party is going to do, they're just going to add more civilians to the equation. So you're kind of stuck in it. So do we need to come up with something completely different?
Okay, yeah.
Which will be accepted, like the khaki uniforms are widely accepted now.
I see what you're saying, because I was going to say something else about the khaki that actually, that's interesting, but actually this was also a proof that the laws of war do not prohibit winning in war, and ruses are also legitimate, but if they don't affect civilians in a way that is does not respect the principle of distinction. So I wondered, because they were still distinguishing themselves. But you're right. So ruses are so we have to play on this kind of line. Try to find ruses try to find ways that still, not to make a complete change, but as I was saying, find ways of interpretation, as I said, the reduction principle, and doing things that are still within the law, but they are still kind of like stretching the lines. That's what we can do, because inventing something new is very difficult. We have to get the consent of too many factors that probably will not be really willing to make this consent right now. But yes, this was a very good example. I didn't really know that, and I was taught too. So thank you.
No, yes. I don't know if that's true. I mean, maybe you could.
Okay, I'll look it up for sure. I'll look it up. It's interesting.
I've gained it from popular literature, so I don't know.
So yeah, we should look it up. So there was a question in the chat, I think, right?
Yeah, there is a question in the
okay, chat. So maybe every generic and irrelevant to the lecture. How do you think the conflict resolution might happen for long term? Wow. Yes, you're right. It is very difficult. But I do want to say, and I wonder, there are now, because there is the military solution that we have to decide who would control the area. And I know that it is very much not really what Israel would like to stay there, but I don't really see the international community really jumping the opportunity and bringing in UN forces. I don't see it happening, and I don't know how we can ever trust the Palestinian Authority. So it's really difficult. But I wondered, because after World War II, there was the plan for what we call the 4 Ds, the letter D, the demilitarization of Germany, democracy, decentralization, and denazification, of course. And this also included a very rooted education program for the values of, tolerance and against racial racism and hatred. And I would so much like to hope that this could ever happen there, because this is actually this is where the roots are. I don't know if we ever, and if there is anybody, I'm sure UNESCO would never do that. They are just, engaging in denouncing Israel from what I call sunrise to sunset. But actually, this could be I think the best solution, but it could take ages, that's for sure, generations. But if we could get to the hearts of the younger people and to educate against hatred, against incitement, I think this is the only thing that could really bring up change. But I don't know.
Again, thank you very much. And I don't get to hear you that much. So now I have the chance, if I may ask another question, okay. Not exactly straight to the point. And again, from the literature, one of my favorite authors describes the future, and he describes the future where he kind of describes it in a cynical way, where there are no more wars because of the international law, because he says that every soldier has to wear a body cam, and there has to be a lawyer whispering in their ear what's allowed and what's not allowed to do. So he says, and the countries, the forces just gave up war because they realized that it wasn't worth it anymore.
I hope so.
He said it was too complicated and there were too much trials, so it wasn't worth it. Was he thinking right? Is that the idea of the international law? Is that what you hope to achieve?
No, I think they tried it, and I kind of stressed this. They tried to give the fighting forces solutions, not to complicate them. Of course, they also give them limitations, because you cannot, the phrasing that says, everything is legitimate in love and war, that probably, or when the canons, I don't know, speak, that the muses are silent and all of that. So this is wrong. The laws of war say no, but they don't try to complicate. They try to solve. As I said, they try to give you solutions. They try. This is what you have. This is why you have special advisors for the IDF. They are called, in Hebrew, they have kind of a funny name, because their abbreviation would be Dabla, which kind of, it doesn't sound too good in Hebrew, but it means it is the abbreviation for the Army's international law advisors, or law, the military international law. And so what they do is try to find ways for the state to fight while still abiding by the laws of war. Many things that I've said are actually things that they have also they have contributed to the literature, to us as scholars that write about the laws of war. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. I believe that we have one more, last question in the chat, and that will conclude with that.
Do you think economic relations direct with Palestine as a separate state can bring about a long-term solution? I think we tried that too. We're trying that with the Palestinian Authority in the Judea and Samaria area, and we all hope. Israel has always tried to work in peace, in peaceful ways to achieve, to talk about peaceful means of resolution, to resolve the conflict. I'm sure that they will try everything, that the government will try what it can do in peaceful means, and what it must do using its military force. And we just have to wait and see. There is no prophecy here, unfortunately. But I hope I also encouraged you, and not, and I hope it wasn't that like discouraging. I hope it was encouraging in a way. So thank you very much for your attention. And I would love to see you when everything is better, let's say.
Thank you very much. It was indeed very encouraging, and again, it was very helpful in understanding, some steps and some things that are being said over the media now, and some things, claims about or explanations about international law. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And I also hope it kind of makes you good ambassadors for Israel, because we need it now. And if you can explain and share the things you've heard here with other people, that would really be very helpful, I think.
Thank you so much, and we'll see everyone on campus, once things settle down a bit, and we'll continue to do what we've been doing always, which is science. Thank you. Right. Have a great evening, everyone.
You too. Bye-bye. Shavua tov. Bye-bye.